Hello! Today we are going to be doing a more detailed walkthrough on how to edit photographs in Lightroom Classic. And for this demo, I'm going to use some photographs I took of objects that are really important or meaningful to me. And I hope that you guys are able to learn a couple more things about strategies in editing. And always please reach out if you do have any questions. So let's get started. I have already added all of my photos into my external hard drive. So I made a folder that says Typology Editing Demo. So these are my demo images that I took this morning. And I've clicked on the import button in Lightroom, and I'm going to navigate over to my hard drive over here that's plugged in and ready to go. And I'm going to go ahead and import this whole folder of images. Now you're going to notice a bit of variation as far as the content. You're going to notice a bit of variation as far as exposure, because I went through and bracketed many of my exposures, meaning some of them are a little bit underexposed, some are properly exposed, some are a little bit overexposed, just giving myself a wide range of things to work with. So for your own purposes, as you're photographing any kind of object or thing to include in your future projects, always make sure to overshoot. The other thing that you'll see in my grid of photographs here that I'm about to import is that I've included my color checker card and a gray card. Again, if you don't have your own color checker card or your own gray card, you can always use an object or a t-shirt or a pair of pants that's a gray tone, a neutral tone, that's not leaning towards blue or not leaning towards yellow, that doesn't have any tint to it. So I've included those so that I can make sure that I check my white balance for my images. And I'm going to hit import. So what I've also done, as you'll see when we go through and cull through these images, is some of my photographs are sort of dealing with light in one place, and then others are maybe the same object but moved with the light in a different place in respect to the object. These awesome sneaker boots, creeper boots being a major example of that. Same exact object, but with the light in a totally different position in respect to the subject. Great, so I've imported all of my images and I am in library mode. Again, if you do not have a notebook or something to write down some keyboard shortcuts today, pause the video and grab that, because we're going to be going over several very, very important shortcuts and some that are going to be review. So I'm in my library module. I'm going to hop over to my develop module in order to start culling through some of my images. And when I say culling, I mean I'm going to set ratings to some images and not rate others. And I'll show you what I mean. So when I got started here, I was photographing this little llama from Ecuador. This one's a little underexposed, but I ultimately want to start with my image that has my gray card. So I'm going to give this one, I'm going to hit the number 1, and I'm just going through these with my arrows. So my arrows on my keyboard is how I'm going to scroll through my images. Again, to make the image really large, you hit the space bar. To go back to grid view, you hit the G button. G for grid, spacebar for full screen. So I'm definitely going to select this one because I'm going to use these neutral tones down here to adjust my color balance. And with this one, I actually changed my white balance to be incorrect. So I changed it to be in tungsten light. And so you'll see the power of the color correction tool with this image in particular. I'm going to give that one a rating of 1 for now. And then great. I also have a just regular gray card or gray piece of poster that I also use to show that you can do this with a wide array of different tools. So I'll give that one a 1. And here's the actual photo that I'm probably going to want to use. I'm going to give that a 1 star for right now. And I'm going to go through and rate all of my images. Now you'll notice with this one, I took a picture of a photograph of myself when I was very little in the same light as that llama there. And in order to get this to be a horizontal orientation, if it didn't automatically correct, I'm going to hold down the Command button on a Mac, or Control if you're working on a PC, Command, and then the bracket, the left and right bracket buttons that are underneath your Delete button on your keyboard. The right bracket will rotate it for you 90 degrees clockwise. The left bracket will rotate the other direction. So find those hard brackets underneath your Delete button and you can make any of those adjustments. Okay, so I think that was my favorite one. I'll keep that. This is my engagement ring, a little bit underexposed here. And I'm going to show you guys and this is the gray card actually that I placed in the same light as the ring on these succulents here. It's a little bit dark, so this will be a good opportunity to walk through how to adjust for slight underexposure or overexposure as you're working through your edit. Here I have a typewriter, and this also has a gray card. Again, as I was working through, let's get that histogram. As I was working through these, I ended up adjusting a few exposure settings. So I went from ISO 400 to ISO 500 as I was bracketing these images. And I like the brighter image a bit better, so we're going to go with that. And so I'll select that guy, and then I'll select this one as well. I picked something sparkly, a sparkly top, because I'm going to ultimately zoom in to just this awesome reflective material. So that will be my edit. Again, I'm just going through with my arrow keys and hitting 1 to rate them. You might have some photos that aren't quite in focus or you missed focus. I would not include those. Like this one, for example, my focus is totally off. I want to make sure that I'm only selecting really nice, crisp, sharp images, like this one, for example. All right, now my shoes example is an interesting one because I photographed it in 2 different environments to kind of see how the lighting would hit differently. So here I have it being backlit by a window that's located up here in the corner. And so the photos came out like this, which is kind of interesting. It's not bad necessarily either. And then I also photographed them to see just on their own, on the floor, with the window actually illuminating them from the front, which gives me a nice, soft, even light as opposed to the high contrast situation happening here. Now, if I'd placed them with the window right behind them, then they'd become silhouetted, which would be an issue. And then I photographed my fiance, and he is here holding the gray card, and you might choose to have some of your subjects do that as well. And then I'm going through and finding his best smile. That's pretty cute. Kind of scared him by saying, let's go take a picture. So his hair was definitely the quarantine hairstyle for sure. I think, yeah, that one's pretty good. One of these will probably make the final cut. And then lastly, I photographed my hat that I got in Ecuador. I have a lot of family there, and it was wonderful to visit them for several weeks last year. I used to live in Ecuador, so many of these Ecuadorian objects are really important to me. All right, and here's me holding the gray card in the light, and I had Ryan, my fiance, take these pictures of me, so if I wanted to include one, I could. That's a pretty good look. And that's a pretty good look too. So we'll pick something out of these ones. Cool. So now I've made all of my star rated selections in my edit. So what I'm going to do is go into my filter over here at the bottom right, and I'm going to click on rated. And that is going to show me all of my filtered out 1-star images. And that's going to be really useful for helping us get started with our color correction process, and then our white and black point compensation, any of our lens corrections. This is going to be really, really helpful. So let's go back to the develop module. Great. And here I have my little llama and the color checker card. So if we want to find what the actual color balance is in this particular lighting situation, what I want to do is first grab this little color checker eyedropper and find that neutral gray. It says pick a target neutral, so I'm going to click on the gray tone here, and it actually corrects my color for me. Now, the interesting and problematic thing about many computers, including some of the ones that are, that you might have open access to in a lab, you don't necessarily know if a computer display monitor is color calibrated or not, how correct it is. Mac monitors tend to be a little bit more saturated in general because they want to make those colors and contrast really, really pop. What you can do in the future, if you move forward with photography, is get a color calibration tool like a Color Monkey or an i1 display calibrator, and that will make sure that your screen monitor is showing you true colors like what you would see if you were printing the image. So let me show you another example here. This is my image of the llama that's like super blue because I put my camera set to tungsten light white balance. I'm going to grab this white balance selector, or I can hit W for white balance, and that immediately gives me that tool. And I'll click over here, and it actually now is indistinguishable from the other one. And this is really helpful, especially if the light is changing in the room or changing in a given setting. And hit W, and yep, it's a very, very slight change, but if I hit that backslash button underneath my delete, I can see a before and after, how that tone kind of warms it up. So that means that once I get to maybe the picture of the llama that I actually want to use after all of those test images, I can synchronize my white balance from my color checker version with my new version. And to do that, I'm going to click on my color checker version with the gray card, and I'm going to click on this little tiny bubble up in the top right hand corner of that thumbnail, and that sets that image as a master. So now if I hold down my shift button and click the one right next door, I can go over to the sync button over here at the bottom right hand corner, hit check none, and all I'm going to synchronize for now is my white balance. So I'm going to hit synchronize, and now if I click on my new image, my white balance has been adjusted, and I can see that if I hit my backslash button underneath the delete. Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to hit Command D or Control D, which will deselect everything, and I'm going to click on my llama that I'm actually going to continue my edit with. So the first thing I want to do in my edit after I set my white balance correctly is find my white and black point compensation. And to do this, you might remember from the last demo, I'm going to hold down my option button, my option key, and I'm going to drag this little slider guy until I can find areas of white. And it looks like it's mostly in this halo of fur around my llama's head. And I'm going to drag that, pull that in until all of that stuff disappears. And that gives me about +11 for whites, which sets that tonal range up here in my histogram so that once I start working with exposure and contrast, I don't push anything that goes out past the whitest whites in my photo. Let's do the same thing with blacks. I'm going to hold down my option key, and I'm going to find all of those dark areas. It's right about there. and then pull it until all of that stuff disappears. Great. Again, you're not going to notice a huge difference, but this is extremely helpful for when you start editing and then start printing any images and start exporting images as JPEGs, because we need to keep all of that color tone and color detail, all of our pixels contained within a given box that will work well as a compressed image file or a printed image file. Okay, so moving forward, the next thing I always want to do after setting my white balance and my black point compensation, white and black point compensation, is scroll down to my lens corrections, where I'm going to make sure these two boxes are checked. I'm going to enable profile corrections and remove chromatic aberration. And again, these two things are going to be really important, especially if you're shooting in high contrast, you're photographing with your kit lens 18 to 55. It will help eliminate some of that barrel distortion in your lens. And it shows me that I was shooting with my Canon 50mm lens. Super cool. All right, so now we're on to all of those tonal adjustments and changes that we can make. So I'm always going to start kind of dealing with my exposure, and instead of using the slider down here, which is also really helpful as a tool, I'm going to go up to my histogram and actually drag this cluster of pixels in my histogram over just a little bit. I'm going to increase my exposure. Now, I never really want to go more than a third of a stop up, or, you know, 0.8 or 0.9, which would be almost a full stop up, because images can start to get a little bit muddy. I should really aim to get them properly exposed in camera, because otherwise you start your editing capability sort of teeters off pretty quickly after that, if you have to push exposure one way or another too far. Then I'm going to look at my highlights and my shadows. Now I know I have this big highlight on my llama's head right here, so I'm actually going to pull down my highlights a little bit. I don't want to pull them down all the way for an image like this, because then, again, the llama starts to look super muddy. I'm going to keep it right about here, just so his face is popping out. So that's about -24. And I might pull my shadows up just a touch to bring up a little bit more detail in the fur. Again, I don't want to push shadows all the way, because then the image starts looking really weird, gray, and flat. But just a little punch of shadows is great. Once I've set exposure, my highlights, and my shadows, I can move on to things like contrast and clarity, and start to make tiny adjustments within my tone curve as well. So for contrast for an object, I'm probably going to keep that around 20, somewhere between 10 and 20. Even 20 seems like it's crushing the blacks a little bit too much. You want to make sure that as you're adjusting contrast, you're still getting a full tonal range. So you're noticing when I push this all the way up to +100, it gets really, really dark in the background. And if I go all the way the other direction, that just looks like a weird muddy gray image. So I find that with an object, you know, or a picture of a person, somewhere between +10 and +20 is a really great sweet spot for contrast, just to kind of punch it up a little bit. Now, if I hit my backslash button, we can see the before and the after. This image is already starting to look a lot better. Now I'm going to pop over here to my texture, clarity, dehaze. Clarity is a way of managing just a touch more sharpness. You can add clarity, which punches up the sharpness of an image and the contrast in some really interesting ways as far as how the algorithm addresses that. If I pull clarity down, it makes it a little bit softer, a little bit hazier. There's times where I like to pull down clarity, like with portraits, and you'll see that in just a moment. And then there's times when I like to push clarity, like with architecture, something that has a lot of structure. With an object like this, I might push up clarity like +12, just to give it a little bit of a pop, but I'm not going to go crazy with it, because again, you start to get weird images like that. Okay. Coming down to the tone curve for this photo, I can add a little bit more of differentiation as far as my full tonal range in my histogram, because the tone curve actually specifically affects lights, darks, and shadows instead of affecting the whole image comprehensively, which allows you a really nice sense of precision when it comes to editing midtones, making sure that there's just a nice range overall in the picture. So if I target lights, for example, you notice it pushes up exposure on just the light parts of my image instead of the whole thing. If I grab my darks, same thing. It only affects the dark areas. If I grab my shadows, same thing. What I typically like to do on many images is add just a little pop of light, like at +5 or +10. With my darks, I'll pull those up just a tiny bit because it works just a touch bit better in my opinion, as opposed to just dealing with the shadows in the first window there. And then shadows here, I'll pull these down just a little bit. And this is a nice way to add a bit more contrast to the image as well. You'll notice if I use this little light switch, I can turn off and on that adjustment. And it's a really subtle difference, but it definitely helps that, that little llama pop forward just a touch more. Great. So I'm going to add a little bit of sharpening, bring that to 50, maybe 60. I've already added some really nice contrast there, dealt with my lens corrections. Awesome. The next thing I want to do is potentially crop my image or any of my images. And to do that, I'm going to hit R, which brings me up to my crop screen. The keyboard is R for crop. And I can adjust this by holding down the Shift key, which will maintain my aspect ratio on that original image. Cool. So now I've tightened up my crop on my llama. What's great is that you can actually affect whether you keep the original aspect ratio. You can make it a 1:1 or a square ratio. I'd have to expand it a bit if I went that route. You can make it a 4:5, 8:10, 5:7, all of these sort of classic printable photo sizes or large medium format photo sizes. And yeah, what I don't encourage you to do is not, like, don't try to do a crop where you just let go of the Shift key and you're, you know, well, I guess it's set to original right now. But don't do a crop that's just loosey-goosey. Always have it either tethered to your original or pick one of the predetermined settings. And I'm going to hit Enter, and that will save the crop on the llama. That sounds weird. Great. And now that I know that this one is edited, I'm going to give that a 2-star. Now, with this photo, I actually photographed it on the same bench as the llama, so I know that my white balance should be hypothetically the same. So what we can do is set this llama image as a master, hold down the Shift key, click the next image just like we did last time, and I can hit Sync, click white balance, hit Synchronize, and there we go. Now this image is also white balanced. So what I'm going to do next is make sure that I check those boxes under my lens corrections. And then I'm going to hold down my Option key in order to find my white point here. I thought it might be in the picture of the table, which totally is, and my black point. And reel in the whitest whites and the darkest blacks. Okay, on to contrast. I'm gonna just kind of default to, well, you know, let's look at exposure first. Right now, I didn't address this right away because it does look like the photo is really properly exposed. I have this big area of shadows in my histogram, and that's essentially from the rest of the photos container and the background of the bench that's being shown. So if I do hit R to crop and hold down that shift key in the process, oops, here we go. I can crop in a little bit tighter on the picture, and my histogram is changing because it's not accounting for all those extra pixels that were present in the background. And you might decide that you want to crop every picture in your final project to a square or to a certain aspect ratio, and that's totally fine too. The great thing about the crop tool is that while this is selected, I can rotate as well and make sure that things are pretty even and feel pretty straight. All right, so that's a little bit closer, and I could crop in even further so it's just this. But with my typology, I do want to make sure that they are all the exact same aspect ratio. So I'm going to keep it like that for now. I'm going to add 20 points of contrast. Exposure looks good because I don't want to blow out this whole table. I'm going to add in or take out some highlights from that linen that's really bright in the picture. Pull up some shadows till I get a tiny bit more detail, not too much dust over here. And just add a little tiny bit of clarity, just a tiny bit of sharpness to that. But this is looking pretty good. You know, I may or may not use the tone curve on this because it is a picture of a picture, and I want to make sure that we maintain some of the integrity of the original instead of modifying it too much. But if I hit that backslash button, it's definitely popping really, really nicely at this point. Okay, onward to this image of the ring, and we're going to go ahead and white balance that. Looks a little bit gray right now, so I put this card in the same light. So I just used that white balance color picker, and I will go ahead and synchronize those. And it's definitely a little bit more, a little bit warmer. I might pull that temperature down just a touch. And what I can do, if I do want to take manual control, is click on the button that says temp, and then use my minus key to make it a little bit cooler, or my plus key to bring it a little bit warmer. And you're going to notice that the temperature over here changes as I do that. Next thing I'm going to do is my lens corrections. And then I will hop back over to my white point and my black point, hold down that option key. To find my whitest whites, my darkest darks. You guys are getting the hang of it at this point. Pull up my exposure a little bit, just because I underexposed about, it looks like about 1 stop. So this doesn't look too bad, but, and this is really sharp, which is great, but I definitely want to make sure that I have my exposure set in the right direction. Contrast, give it a little bit of a punch there. Highlights, I'm going to pull this down a little bit because some of the cacti around the ring are pretty bright, about -30. I tend to find that my highlights end up being about -30, -20 in general. Then I'm going to push up my shadows just a touch to bring in a little bit more detail into the surrounding area. And then, you know what? I'm actually going to pull this to 25 because it's kind of an architectural object here. I'm going to add some really nice clarity to that, just, you know, maybe 15, something pretty, yep, straightforward, before, after. And then once I'm ready to add in a bit of change in terms of my tone curve. Just push up some darks, pull back some shadows, kind of create a bit more contrast with this. I can hit the R button for my crop. I'm holding down the Shift key, pushing that over, and I'm using the rule of thirds, this grid that happens whenever I hit the crop button, to make sure that my subject is either in the middle or on one of the thirds in that frame. And then enter. What I'm noticing about this image is that the background actually, in some cases, is brighter and more highlighty than my actual subject. And so this image is actually a really great candidate for a very light, not even noticeable vignette. And again, the philosophy on vignettes is if you're going to use them, no one should be able to tell that you're using a vignette. So if I go down to my effects module over here on the right hand side, I never want to have a vignette that looks like that, because that's obvious. There's an obvious circle going on. But if I pull it down just a little bit, maybe bring in that midpoint a tiny bit, I'm actually able to darken some of the distractions of the background and really focus in on the sheen of the ring that's right here. So I can turn that off, turn it back on, and all of a sudden I have this really lovely edit of the engagement ring. And if I pick this image, maybe I want to pick this image, I don't know, but what I can always do now that I have an edited one is click that little button. I'm gonna actually Command D to deselect everything. I have this one set as a master because I clicked that little bubble in the top right. I'm gonna hold down my Shift key, click on the next image, and hit sync. And I'm going to check basically everything that I affected, from clarity, oh, I forgot to do sharpening, but we'll come back to that. Color, my lens corrections, all of that is going to get applied over here. I can add that effect as well. And now this image has the exact same settings because it was taken in the exact same type of light, and all I need to do is crop it. Boom. That looks pretty good. If anyone's an aspiring wedding photographer, I have a lot of experience in that area, and I'm happy to talk to you about that at any given time. Cool. So we can go through and keep editing each of these. Now you pretty much know the drill. And I think I'm actually going to skip ahead a bit. I kind of talked about how these are going to look different depending on how you position a given object to the light, but I'd actually like to skip ahead and talk about the portraits. And so if you're taking portraits or you're in a lot of your images yourself, there's a couple of things that I will do differently when editing a portrait as opposed to editing an object. And we're going to go more in detail with this in a future demo, but I will intro it here so that you have a good starting point. First things first, grab and white balance that. I might pull that temperature down just a tiny bit. Again, I'm working with a screen that's not calibrated, probably like you. And I have taken down that just a tiny bit temperature till it feels right in my eyes. But this is actual window light hitting the side of his face. I'm going to hit that bubble icon, hold down the Shift key, grab all three of these portraits that are up for consideration, hit sync, check none, and then just check the white balance. The The other thing that I'm able to do, actually, if I wanted, I could set my black and white point here and do those other, like, basic edits that I know will apply no matter what, like my lens corrections, etc. I don't necessarily want to add a lot of sharpening to a portrait. I wouldn't go past like 40 or 50 for a portrait because it's kind of nice to keep a little bit of a softness when you're looking at a portrait of someone, I've found. Other people might disagree. I'm going to hit sync. We want white balance. We want a little bit of sharpening. We want black clipping and white clipping. And we want lens corrections. Great. So all of those are now set and ready to go. So for portraits, what I like to do is make sure that, like, he's in really, really great light right here. I could add a bit more exposure, but I'm pretty sure I got the exposure spot on. And if I bring that up any higher, I'm going to lose and blow out this side of his face that's closest to the light. So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to add in a little bit of contrast. Between 10 and 20 generally seems to be a good amount for a portrait. Always make sure you're focused in on the eyes when you're taking a portrait. Eyes should be super, super sharp. I might pull down highlights just a tad to kind of save this side of his face. Might pull up shadows just a little bit to get a bit more detail in his jacket. And then hopping down to my tone curve, I'll add in just maybe a little bit of lights and then push up my darks a bit to kind of even out the left-hand side. And then shadows, I'm going to pull these down a bit just to kind of simulate a touch more contrast. And you might be watching me and being like, oh my God, this is so much. How am I going to remember all of this? Trust me, once you've done it many, many times, it starts to become like clockwork, which is the goal. And it doesn't really look like I need to adjust anything as far as hue, saturation, luminance, or any of my colors in the actual image. His cheeks are a little bit magenta, a little bit rosy, because he was working out. So I might pull that down like -15. I might pull this down -15 just to get rid of some of the purples in his face. And the this particular type of wood might be a little orangey, so maybe I'll pull down my oranges -10. It's very subtle, but sometimes it's a nice effect. With portraits, what I like to do is pull down clarity a little bit, like -10, -15, because it kind of softens the whole image just a little bit, which is nice. So -10 is maybe a good direction to go in. And now if I hit the backslash button, here's my before, here's my after. I definitely filled in a bit more light on this side. If I feel like it's a bit too much, I can always add in a little bit more contrast, which is going to separate those. Or I can pull back my shadows a bit if I want to get that drama back. Hit R to crop. Pull this in a little tiny bit, not too much, because I don't want to crop out his hands or his hair. And there we go. Before, after. Nice. So again, once you have selected all of the images from your shoot, I still have some editing to do, but you'll walk through the same exact process as far as exporting your images, and then you'll be able to start placing them into your typology grid. Yeah, So the goal is to get you guys feeling really familiar with Lightroom, editing processes, and dealing with the tone curve, starting to identify basic editing skills. And then also, as we move forward, you're going to see some differences in editing based on your subject, whether it's an object, a portrait, a landscape. It's going to be a little bit different process. So I hope this was helpful, and reach out if you have any questions.